The rain came to Ashworth Manor as it always did in the autumn of 1847, not gently, not with mercy, but in great sheets of grey that lashed against the ancient stones like a punishment from the heavens themselves. The manor rose from the Yorkshire moors like a dark sentinel, its towers piercing the low-hanging clouds, its windows reflecting nothing but the endless storm. Ivy crawled across the western facade with the slow determination of decades, and the chimneys, 12 in total, though only 3 ever released, smoke stood against the sky like broken fingers reaching toward a god who had long since turned his face away. This was the seat of the Dukes of Ashworth, passed through 10 generations of Blackwood blood, and in all those centuries the villagers who lived in the shadow of its influence swore that the house had never known a single day of true sunlight. They spoke of it in hushed voices at the tavern, in whispers after Sunday services, in the careful warnings mothers gave to children who wandered too close to the estate's crumbling stone walls. Times, stay away from Ashworth Manor, stay away from the ruthless Duke. Asterisk, for within those rain-soaked walls lived Lord Sebastian Blackwood, the 11th Duke of Ashworth, and his reputation preceded him like a cold wind across the moors. The servants who attended him, a skeleton staff of those too old or too desperate to seek employment elsewhere, moved through the corridors with downcast eyes and measured footsteps. They had learned, in the 5 years since the tragedy that none of them dared name aloud, that their master preferred silence to speech, shadow to light, solitude to any form of human warmth. Cook whispered to Mrs. Thornton that she had not seen him smile since the year the old Queen took her throne, and Mrs. Thornton, who had been in service since the current Duke was a boy in short pants, could only press her lips together and remember a different time, a different Sebastian, before grief had calcified into something that looked remarkably like cruelty. The garden that had once been the pride of the county now lay in tangles of dead roses and overgrown hedges, the fountain at its centre silent and choked with autumn leaves. And the east wing, once filled with music and laughter, stood locked and forbidden, its windows dark, its secrets preserved behind oak doors that had not opened in half a decade. On this particular evening, as October bled into November and the rain showed no signs of mercy, the Duke stood at his study window, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, and watched the storm assault his ancestral home. His reflection in the glass revealed a face that might have been carved from the same grey stone as the manor itself, sharp cheekbones, a jaw set in permanent tension, dark hair swept back from a brow that seemed designed for brooding, and eyes the colour of winter seas, cold and fathomless, and touched with something that might have been sorrow if one dared look long enough to name it. He did not know that tomorrow would bring a carriage through the gates, carrying within it a woman who would challenge everything he believed about himself, about love, about the carefully constructed walls he had built around his frozen heart. He knew only the rain and the silence and the weight of promises he intended never to break. The carriage that wound its way through the manor gates the following afternoon carried within it a woman who had learned, in the span of a single fortnight, that the life she had imagined for herself, the modest comforts, the eventual marriage to some kind-eyed country gentleman, the children she would raise in a house filled with books and laughter, had been nothing more than a pleasant dream from which circumstance had violently shaken her awake. Lady Eleanora Wren, daughter of the disgraced Viscount Ashford, sat with her gloved hands folded in her lap and her spine pressed firmly against the worn velvet seat, watching through rain-spattered glass as Ashworth Manor rose before her like a promise of purgatory. She was 24, pale from sleepless nights and the particular exhaustion that comes from weeping until one's body simply refuses to produce any further tears, and yet there remained in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her grey eyes a dignity that poverty and desperation had not yet managed to extinguish. Her father's debts accumulated through years of poor investments, trusted friends who proved unworthy of trust, and the slow, inexorable decline that seemed to plague families who clung to titles without the fortune to support them had finally come due, and the creditors had shown no mercy. Debtor's prison had loomed like a death sentence for a man already weakened by shame and age, and Eleanora had been prepared to sell every remaining possession, to work her fingers raw if necessary, when the letter had arrived bearing the Ashworth seal. The Duke's terms had been precise, clinical, utterly devoid of sentiment. He would purchase the entirety of her father's debts and ensure the Viscount's comfortable retirement to a small cottage in the south, and, in exchange, Eleonora would become his wife. No explanation had been offered for why a man of his wealth and position would seek a bride from a ruined family. No pretense of courtship or affection, merely a transaction as coldly efficient as any business arrangement. She had agreed because there had been no other choice. And now, as the carriage shuddered to a halt before the manor's great oak doors, she pressed her palm flat against her chest and forced her racing heart to steady. The butler who greeted her was ancient and unsmiling, and the footman who carried her single trunk moved with the hushed efficiency of men accustomed to silence. She was led through corridors that smelled of dust and disuse, past windows that seemed to reject what little grey light the afternoon offered, until she stood at last before the doors of the Duke's study. He did not rise when she entered. Sebastian Blackwood sat behind a massive desk of dark mahogany, papers spread before him, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, cataloguing, assessing, finding her wanting or suitable, she could not tell. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, and devastating in the way that a winter storm is devastating, all sharp edges and barely contained power, his dark hair falling across a forehead creased with what might have been displeasure or might simply have been his natural state. Asterisk, beautiful asterisk, she thought unwillingly, and then immediately, asterisk and cruel asterisk. Lady Eleonora, he said, and his voice was low, clipped, utterly without warmth. You understand the terms of our arrangement. It was not a question, but she answered nonetheless, her own voice steadier than she felt. I do, Your Grace. He rose then, moving around the desk with the fluid grace of a predator, and stopped close enough that she could see the winter sea grey of his eyes. Could smell sandalwood and something darker beneath. Then let me be clear, he said, each word a stone dropped into still water. I will never love you. Do not mistake duty for affection. You will have comfort, security, the protection of my name. But my heart is not part of this bargain. It is not mine to give. Eleonora held his gaze, though something inside her chest tightened painfully at the finality in his tone. I did not come here expecting love, Your Grace, she replied quietly, and if her voice trembled slightly, she refused to let her eyes fall. I came here to save my father. That is arrangement enough for me. Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, or the ghost of respect, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the mask of stone she suspected he showed to all the world. He turned away, dismissing her with his silence, and Eleonora followed the waiting housekeeper to her chambers, her head held high, her heart already learning the geography of its new prison. The chapel at Ashworth Manor had not seen a wedding in 11 years, and its cold stone walls seemed to resent the intrusion, the candles flickering in draughts that crept through ancient mortar, their weak light doing little to dispel the gloom that clung to every corner like a living thing. Eleonora stood in a gown of pale grey silk, not white, for this was not a celebration, and they had both understood without speaking that to dress the occasion in traditional trappings would be a mockery. Neither could stomach, and listened to the vicar's droning words as if from a great distance, as if she were watching some other woman pledge her life to a man carved from winter itself. There were no guests to witness the union, no flowers adorning the altar, no music to herald her walk down the narrow aisle. There was only the rain that had not ceased since her arrival, drumming against the chapel's stained glass windows like the fingers of all the ghosts this house surely contained. And there was Sebastian, standing rigid at the altar in black that matched the shadows beneath his eyes, speaking his vows in a voice utterly devoid of feeling. Asterisk. This is the death of one life and the beginning of another. Asterisk, Eleonora thought. As she repeated the words, the vicar fed her, her own voice strange and hollow in her ears. Asterisk, and I must mourn the first if I am to survive the second. Asterisk. She had dreamed, once foolish, girlish dreams, that she had kept folded in her heart, like pressed flowers of a wedding day filled with her mother's tears of joy, her father's proud smile, a man who looked at her as if she were the answer to every prayer he had ever whispered into the dark. That bride, that dream, dissolved like morning mist as the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Sebastian did not kiss her, did not even reach for her hand, merely inclined his head in what might have been acknowledgement before turning to sign the register as if completing a business transaction. The wedding breakfast was a silent affair in the small dining room, the food untouched on Eleonora's plate, her new husband seated at the far end of the table, like a stranger sharing a public coach. When evening fell, and the servants had cleared away the evidence of their joyless celebration, Eleanora was led to the Duchess's chambers' grand rooms that smelled of lavender and disuse, their heavy curtains drawn against the night, and she sat before the mirror in her nightgown, brushing her hair with methodical strokes, waiting for a husband who did not come. The clock struck midnight, and then 1, and still she sat, until at last she understood that he would not cross the threshold that separated his chambers from hers, that their marriage would be one of formality and silence and carefully maintained distance. She rose and went to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass, watching as lightning split the sky above the moors in jagged rivers of white fire, illuminating for one brief instant the wild landscape that was now her home, her prison, her penance for the sin of being born into a family that could not keep its fortunes. I will not break, she told herself, told the storm, told the darkness that pressed against the glass. I will not let him see me break. I will find a way to survive this house and this man, and perhaps, in surviving, I will discover something worth living for. The thunder rolled across the moors like the voice of God, and Eleanora Blackwood, Duchess of Ashworth, stood alone on her wedding night and did not weep. The days that followed her wedding dissolved into one another like watercolors bleeding at their edges, each morning bringing the same grey light through the same heavy curtains, each evening finding Eleanora alone in chambers that felt less like rooms than like beautifully appointed cells. And so she did what any prisoner with wit and will might do. She began to map the boundaries of her confinement, to learn the geography of this house of shadows that was now, by law and contract, her home. Ashworth Manor revealed itself reluctantly, its corridors twisting in ways that defied logic, its rooms opening onto other rooms in a labyrinthine sprawl that spoke of generations of additions and modifications, each lord adding his own vision without regard for what had come before, until the whole had become a monument to noble eccentricity and architectural confusion. She wandered through galleries hung with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, through parlors where dust sheets covered furniture like shrouds over the recently deceased, through a conservatory whose glass panels were so begrimed with age that the weak sunlight filtered through in sickly yellow streams, and everywhere she went, she felt the weight of watching eyed servants who fell silent at her approach, who curtsied or bowed with mechanical precision before melting back into the shadows from which they had emerged. It was on the 4th day of her explorations that she discovered the East Wing, or rather, discovered that she could not discover it a heavy oak door, locked fast, standing at the end of a corridor whose candles had been allowed to gutter and die, and when she pressed her palm against the wood, she felt something that might have been a draught from the other side, cold and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. She did not ask about the locked door, some instinct warning her that questions about certain things in this house would not be welcome. But later that same day, while exploring a forgotten sitting room on the 3rd floor, she found it a portrait leaning against the wall, its face turned away as if in shame, and when she lifted the dusty cloth that covered it, she found herself staring into the painted eyes of a young woman of extraordinary beauty, dark-haired and pale-skinned, with a smile that seemed to hold some secret sorrow, some knowledge of tragedy yet to come. She was still standing there, transfixed by those painted eyes, when a voice behind her made her start. That would be the late Duchess, Your Grace, and she turned to find Mrs. Thornton, the aging housekeeper, watching her with an expression that mingled wariness with something that might, in better light, have resembled sympathy. The old woman's hands were roughened by decades of work, but her eyes were kind, and over tea in the housekeeper's sitting room, a small rebellion against protocol that Mrs. Thornton seemed willing to risk, Eleanora learned the rhythms of the household, the names of the servants, the times when the Duke preferred absolute solitude, and the places where he was never to be disturbed, and she began to notice, too, the inconsistencies that did not fit the portrait of a ruthless man, the bowls of scraps left at the kitchen door for the stray dogs that roamed the estate, the gardener's young son sporting new shoes that his father's wages could never have afforded, the way the servants spoke of their master with fear. Yes, but also with a confused loyalty that suggested they had seen something in him that the world had not, and Eleanora tucked these observations away like pressed flowers in a book, small pieces of a puzzle she did not yet understand, but was determined, in the long, empty hours that stretched before her, to solve. Weeks passed in the grey sameness of Ashworth Manor, and Eleanora learned to build a life from the small materials available to her morning tea, taken in the conservatory she had slowly cleaned with her own hands, afternoons spent reading in the south-facing parlour where the light was least unkind, evenings of needlework by the fire in her private sitting room, the needle rising and falling in rhythms that soothed her restless mind, and through it all, she and Sebastian moved through the same house like ships, navigating the same waters by different stars, passing occasionally in corridors where he would incline his head in curt acknowledgement before continuing on his way, sharing meals in silence so complete that the scrape of silver against porcelain seemed thunderous, maintaining the careful choreography of strangers who happened to share a name and a roof, but nothing more. She learned his patterns as one learns the patterns of weather when he rode out across the moors, when he closeted himself in his study with ledgers and correspondence, when he descended to the wine cellar and did not emerge until the small hours, and she shaped her own movements to avoid collision, to preserve the fragile peace of mutual avoidance that seemed the best either of them could hope for. But it was on a night when sleep would not come, when the wind howled against her windows like a creature seeking entry, that Eleanora wrapped herself in a shawl and ventured down to the library in search of something, anything, to quiet her racing thoughts. And there she found him, Sebastian, standing before the dying fire with a book in his hands, his dark hair dishevelled as if he had been running his fingers through it, his face in the firelight stripped of its usual cold mask, and wearing instead an expression of such raw, unguarded sorrow that she stopped in the doorway, breath-catching, feeling as though she had stumbled upon something private, something sacred, something she had no right to witness. He looked up at the small sound she made, and for one suspended moment their eyes met across the shadowed room, and she saw in his gaze something that looked almost like loneliness, almost like longing, before the familiar ice descended and his jaw hardened, and he snapped, the book closed with unnecessary force. "The library is available to you during daylight hours, madam," he said, his voice carrying the cutting edge she had come to expect. I had thought that understood. She should have retreated, should have murmured an apology and fled back to her chambers, but something, perhaps the glimpse of that unguarded face, perhaps the spine of the book she could now see in his hands, a volume of Byron's poetry, hardly the reading material of a man with no soul, made her hold her ground. "I could not sleep," she said simply. "I meant no intrusion." He stared at her for a long moment, and she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, some struggle she could not name, before he set the book aside and strode past her without another word, leaving her alone in the library with the smell of wood smoke and old paper and the ghost of whatever grief had carved those lines around his mouth. Asterisk, there is more to him than ice asterisk, she thought, standing where he had stood, her fingers brushing the spine of the Byron he had abandoned. Asterisk, there are depths beneath that frozen surface, waters that run dark and fast and filled with pain he will not name, and I have seen them now, and I cannot unsee them, cannot return to believing him simply cruel. Asterisk, she took the poetry back to her chambers and read until dawn silvered the windows, and she did not know it yet, but something had shifted in the careful architecture of her heart. Some wall had developed its first hairline crack, and through that crack, dangerous as spring light through winter ice, the first pale tendril of curiosity had begun to grow. The village of Ashworth Hollow lay 3 miles distant from the manor, a cluster of stone cottages and modest shops huddled together as if for warmth against the perpetual grey that seemed to hang over this corner of England like a curse, and it was to this village that Eleanora ventured on a morning when the walls of her gilded prison had pressed too close and the silence had grown too loud. Taking the small curricle that Mrs. Thornton had assured her was at her disposal, though the groom who hitched the horses watched her with the wary eyes of a man who expected her to return in tears or not return at all. The cobblestone high street fell quiet as she passed, conversations dying mid-sentence, shopkeepers pausing in their doorways to stare at the new Duchess of Ashworth as though she were some exotic creature escaped from a menagerie, and she felt their gazes like the prick of needles against her skin. Curiosity, yes, but also fear, and something that looked almost like pity, as though they knew something about her fate that she herself had not yet learned. She stopped at the milliner's shop for ribbons she did not need, at the apothecary for lavender water she would not use, and everywhere she went, The responses were the same. Brittle politeness that shattered into whispers the moment she turned away, sidelong glances exchanged between villagers who had known each other all their lives and shared secrets they would never share with her. It was in the churchyard, where she had wandered to escape the oppressive weight of all those watching eyes, that she found the grave, a white marble angel weeping over a stone that read simply, Isabel, Duchess of Ashworth, 1820 to 1842, beloved, and she was still standing there, reading that single word over and over, when a voice creaked behind her like an old gate swinging in the wind. "You'd be the new one, then," said the old woman, bent nearly double over a walking stick, her face a map of wrinkles and her eyes sharp as broken glass. "Come to see what became of the last." The woman's name was Agnes, and she had lived in Ashworth Hollow for 80 years, had known the Duke's grandfather and his father, and had watched young Sebastian grow from a laughing boy into a man of ice and shadow, and she spoke now with the freedom of the very old, who have outlived their fear of consequences. "Died of a fever, they say," Agnes murmured, nodding toward the grave. "But fever don't explain. The screaming folk heard from the manor in those final days don't explain why His Grace locked himself away for a year afterward and emerged a different man entirely. Don't explain why he's never spoken her name since the earth closed over her." But then the old woman's voice softened, took on a texture almost like tenderness, and she spoke of the young Duke, as he had been before, generous, warm, given to laughter that could fill a room like sunlight, devoted to his young bride with a passion that had been the envy of the county. And Eleanora listened, with her heart beating strange and fast, understanding now that the man she had married was not the man he had always been, that somewhere beneath the ice lay the ruins of someone else entirely, someone destroyed by whatever had happened in that locked East Wing 5 years ago, and she walked back to her curricle with more questions than answers, but also with something new burning in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps its distant cousin, the first faint stirring of belief that frozen things might sometimes, with patience and warmth, learn to thaw. The storm announced itself hours before it arrived, the sky darkening to the color of a bruise, the air growing thick and electric, with a charge that made the hair rise on Eleanora's arms and set the horses in the stables to nervous whinnying. And by the time night fell, the heavens had opened with a fury that seemed almost personal, rain lashing against the windows like fists demanding entry, thunder rolling across the moors in great crashing waves that shook the very foundations of Ashworth Manor, lightning splitting the darkness with such ferocity that the servants crossed themselves and whispered prayers and retreated to their quarters below stairs, leaving the vast house to creak and groan around its 2 inhabitants like a ship caught in a tempest at sea. Eleanora sat in her chamber with a book she could not read, the words swimming before her eyes each time the thunder cracked, and she told herself it was only the storm that kept her awake, only the violence of the weather that set her heart racing. But sometime after midnight, when the tempest reached its terrible crescendo, she heard something, beneath the roar of wind and rain, a sound that froze her blood and drew her from her bed, despite every instinct, screaming at her to stay hidden. A cry, ragged and anguished, tearing through the walls from the master's chambers down the corridor, and she stood in her nightgown with her hand pressed to her throat, listening to Sebastian Blackwood, the ruthless Duke, the man of ice and silence, screaming in his sleep like a man being torn apart from the inside. The cries came in waves, words she could not quite make out, but whose anguish needed no translation. Times, no, times and times, please times, and a name that might have been Isabel or might have been something else entirely. And Eleanora found herself moving before thousand. She had decided to move, her bare feet cold against the floorboards, her candle guttering in the draughts that prowled the darkened hallway, until she stood before his door, with her hand raised to knock, and her courage failing her, knowing she had no right to witness this, no right to intrude upon grief so private and so raw, and yet unable to walk away, unable to leave him alone in whatever nightmare held him captive. She did not knock. In the end she went instead to the kitchen, navigating the unfamiliar stairs by lightning flash and memory, and she heated water over the banked coals of the great stove and prepared tea with hands that trembled only slightly, adding honey, the way Mrs. Thornton had mentioned. His Grace preferred it, though he would never admit to such a small sweetness, and she carried the cup back up through the storm-shaken house and set it on the floor outside his door. A small offering, a wordless acknowledgement that she had heard, that someone in this cold world knew he suffered, and then she retreated to her own chambers and lay awake until dawn broke grey and exhausted over the moors. She did not expect acknowledgement, had not done it for thanks, but for something far simpler, the same instinct that made her leave bread for the stray dogs and speak gently to the servants' children. But when she emerged from her room in the pale morning light, she found the cup empty on its saucer, and Sebastian standing at the end of the corridor, his face haggard with sleeplessness, his eyes holding hers for one long, unguarded moment before he spoke, his voice hoarse and strange. Asterisk, thank you. Asterisk. Just that 2 words, barely more than a whisper, and then he was gone, disappeared into his study, the door closing behind him with a soft click. But Eleonora stood rooted to the spot, with her heart pounding against her ribs, because those 2 words had cost him something. She could see it, and they were the first true thing he had ever given her. The months that followed moved like honey through glass, slow, golden in unexpected moments, transforming the texture of Eleonora's days in ways so subtle she scarcely noticed until she looked back and saw how far she had travelled from the frightened bride who had stood at that rain-streaked window on her wedding night. She had begun, almost without meaning to leave her mark upon the manor's forgotten corners, a vase of wildflowers on the windowsill of the breakfast room, where morning light pooled like spilled cream, fresh linens scented with lavender in the guest chambers that had stood empty for years, cushions recovered in soft blues and greens to replace the funereal blacks and greys that had dominated every room, as if the house itself were in perpetual mourning. The servants noticed, of course they noticed, and their wariness toward her gradually softened into something approaching warmth. Mrs. Thornton's eyes growing misty when she discovered that Eleonora had mended the tear in the kitchen curtains herself rather than demanding new ones be purchased, the scullery maid blushing with pleasure when the Duchess remembered her name and asked after her ailing mother. But it was with Thomas, the gardener's deaf son, that Eleonora's kindness shone most clearly, for she had taken it upon herself to learn the hand signs the boy used to communicate, sitting with him in the garden for hours while he taught her the language of his silent world, and she had begun teaching him his letters in return, tracing them in the dirt with a stick, while he watched with dark eyes bright as polished stones. And she did not know, could not have known that. Sebastian watched these lessons from the library window, his book forgotten in his hands, something cracking open in his chest like ice breaking on a frozen river. He found himself cataloguing her kindnesses, the way a scholar catalogues specimens, the way she always served the servants tea when they came to discuss household matters with her, as if they were guests rather than employees, the way she had quietly arranged for the washerwoman's wages to be increased after learning the woman was supporting 3 younger siblings, the way she spoke to everyone, from the lowest stable boy to the visiting vicar, with the same gentle courtesy that seemed as natural to her as breathing. Asterisk, she is not like Isabel, asterisk, he thought one evening, watching her through the doorway as she sat with Thomas in the fading light, her hands moving gracefully through the air. Her laughter, when had he last heard laughter in this house, floating through the still air like music? And then, hard on the heels of that thought, asterisk, she is not like anyone, asterisk. The realization unsettled him in ways he could not name, for he had built his fortress well, had mortared every stone with guilt and grief and the cold certainty that he was incapable of feeling anything good without destroying it. And yet here she was, this woman he had married for convenience and spite, quietly dismantling his defenses with nothing more than flowers in empty vases and kindness to a deaf boy. And he did not know how to fight an enemy who did not know she was waging war, did not know how to protect himself from someone whose only weapon was warmth. It was a grey afternoon in late autumn when Eleonora discovered the door to the east wing standing ajar, not fully open, but cracked just enough to suggest that someone had passed through recently and forgotten to secure it. And she stood in the dim corridor, with her heart beating strangely fast, knowing she should walk away, knowing this was a threshold she had been warned not to cross, and yet her feet carried her forward as if drawn by some invisible thread, her hand pressing against the ancient wood until it swung inward on hinges that groaned like the voice of the house itself, protesting this intrusion into its most sacred grief. The air inside was thick with dust and the ghost scent of roses long since withered, and Eleonora moved through rooms that had been frozen in time, furniture draped in white cloths like shrouds, mirrors covered as if the house could not bear to see its own reflection, until she came at last to the chamber that could only have been Time's hers. Time's Isabel's preserved with such desperate fidelity that Eleonora half expected to see the woman herself rise from the bed with its faded silk coverlet, to turn from the vanity where silver brushes still lay, arranged beside bottles of perfume whose contents had long since evaporated into memory. But it was the letters that undid her, the letters she found in a rosewood box on the writing desk, tied with ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to the color of winter sky, and though every principle of honor told her she should not read them, her hands moved of their own accord, unfolding paper grown brittle with age, and she learned at last the truth that Sebastian had buried in this sealed wing along with his heart. Isabel had been ill not in body but in spirit, afflicted with a darkness of the mind that no physician could cure and no love could reach, and her letters spoke of shadows that followed her through sunlit rooms, of a despair so profound it had its own weight, its own voice, whispering to her in the quiet hours that she was a burden, that Sebastian would be better without her, that the only kindness left to her was to set him free. The final letter was addressed to him, Times, "My darling Sebastian, forgive me. I am not strong enough. I have tried, but the darkness is stronger, Times," and Eleonora pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle the sob that rose in her throat, because she understood now, understood the guilt that had calcified around his heart like stone, the terrible conviction that he had failed to save the woman he loved, that his love itself had somehow been insufficient, poison rather than cure. She sat for a long time in that room of ghosts, holding the letters of a woman she had never known, grieving for her, grieving for him. And when she finally rose to leave, she plucked a single white rose from the vase she had placed in the hallway that morning and laid it gently on Isabel's vanity, a silent offering, a promise to honor this sorrow even as she fought to free its survivor from its grip, and she sealed the wing behind her and spoke not a word of what she had found, carrying the weight of Sebastian's secret like a gift she had not yet earned the right to return. The crisis came without warning, as crises so often do, arriving not on the wings of storm or scandal, but in the small, terrifying form of a child burning with fever. Thomas, the gardener's deaf son, who had become as dear to Eleonora as if he were her own blood, found collapsed among the rose bushes he had been helping her tend, his skin blazing hot to the touch, his dark eyes glassy and unseeing, as she gathered him in her arms and carried him into the manor with a strength born of pure, desperate love. The household erupted into barely contained panic, servants rushing for cold water and clean linens, while Mrs. Thornton sent a rider to fetch Dr. Pemberton from the village, but the rider returned within the hour, alone and ashen-faced with the news that the doctor would not come, would not set foot on Ashworth land, not for any sum, not even for a dying child, for the old superstitions ran deep, and the Duke's reputation cast a shadow that reached even into matters of life and death. Eleonora was in Thomas's sick room, pressing cool cloths to his forehead and fighting back tears of helpless rage, when she heard the front doors slam open with such force that the sound echoed through the manor like thunder. And then Sebastian was there in the doorway, still wearing his riding clothes, mud-spattered and wild-eyed in a way she had never seen him, and before she could speak, he had crossed to the bedside and knelt beside the boy, his hand, that hand, which had signed documents of ruin and written words of ice, pressing against Thomas's burning cheek with a tenderness that stole Eleonora's breath. "He will not come," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The doctor refuses." But Sebastian was already rising, his jaw set like granite, his eyes holding a fire that had nothing of coldness in it, and he said only, "Then I will bring him," and was gone into the night before she could protest that the hour was late, that the roads were treacherous, that no threat or bribe had ever moved. Dr. Pemberton, when his fear was roused. The hours that followed were the longest of Eleonora's life, measured in the shallow rasps of Thomas's breathing and the endless striking of the grandfather clock in the hall, and she talked to the boy though he could not hear her, signed the words, "Times, I am here, you are safe. Help is coming," Times, over and over against his limp fingers, willing him to feel her presence if nothing else, and she prayed to God, to fate, to whatever power might listen, that Sebastian would return in time, that the child would live, that she would not lose this small bright soul who had taught her to speak with her hands and smile with her heart. And then, as the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the curtains like a whispered promise, she heard hoofbeats on the drive, and Sebastian burst through the door with a white-haired man in tow, not Dr. Pemberton, but a physician from the next county, roused from his bed and brought at a gallop through the darkness by a duke who had refused to take no for an answer, and together they worked through the breaking morning, Eleonora and Sebastian side by side, following the doctor's instructions, holding Thomas's hands, cooling his fever, until at last the physician straightened and said the words that released the breath Eleonora had been holding for hours. "The fever is breaking, he will live." She looked up then, exhausted and tear-streaked and trembling, and found Sebastian's eyes already upon her, and in that gaze something passed between them that neither could have named gratitude and recognition, and the first fragile stirrings of a bond forged not in words but in shared vigil, in desperate hope, in the simple human act of fighting together for a life that mattered. The garden had become Eleonora's sanctuary in the weeks that followed Thomas's recovery, a living testament to what patience and tender care could coax from even the most neglected soil, and she was there among the roses at dusk when she heard footsteps on the gravel path. Behind her footsteps she had come to know as intimately as her own heartbeat, though she could not have said precisely when Sebastian's presence had become something her body recognized before her mind could name it. He stood at the edge of the rose bed for a long moment, watching her work, and when she finally turned to face him, she saw something in his expression that made her set down her pruning shears and rise to meet him, brushing soil from her gloves, waiting with a stillness that seemed to draw the very confession from his lips. "You found her letters," he said, and it was not a question but a statement of fact, spoken without accusation. And Eleonora did not insult him with denial, but simply nodded, her eyes steady on his face, and the silence that stretched between them was not uncomfortable but expectant, pregnant with words that had waited 5 years to be spoken. "I loved her," Sebastian continued, his voice rough, as if the words themselves had thorns. "Or I believed I did. I was young and she was beautiful, and I thought love meant possession, protection, the arrogant certainty that I could be enough for another person, that my devotion could shield her from every darkness." He turned away, his profile sharp against the dying light, and Eleonora watched his hands clench at his sides as he continued. "But the darkness was inside her, and no matter how I tried, no matter the physicians I summoned, the treatments I demanded, the hours I spent at her bedside swearing I would not let her go, I could not reach her, could not pull her back from the edge of that abyss, and in the end she chose the darkness over me, and I have spent every day since believing that I was not her salvation, but her destruction, that something in me, some coldness, some insufficiency drove her to seek the only escape I could not prevent." The anguish in his voice was almost unbearable, and Eleonora moved toward him without conscious thought, stopping close enough to touch though she did not yet reach for him, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but certain, carrying the weight of everything she had learned in Isabel's frozen chamber. "Perhaps you were not her destruction. Perhaps grief has rewritten your memory, made you the villain in a tragedy that had no villains, only victims." Sebastian turned to face her, and she saw the glitter of unshed tears in eyes that had shown her nothing but ice since the day she arrived, and she continued gently, "The letters I read spoke of a woman who loved you desperately and hated herself for being unable to feel that love as she believed she should. Her darkness was not your failure, Sebastian. It was an illness of the spirit that no amount of devotion could cure, and the greatest cruelty of her death is that it left you believing you were to blame for something that was never within your power to prevent." He stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign tongue, as if the concept of absolution was so alien to him that he could not comprehend its shape, and in the fading light of the garden she had brought back to life, Eleonora saw the first crack appear in the wall he had built around his heart, not a collapse, not yet, but a fracture through which light might eventually pour, and she knew in that moment that she would wait as long as it took for the rest of the walls to crumble, that she would tend this wounded man as patiently as she had tended these roses, believing always in the bloom that waited beneath the thorns. The realization came to Eleonora not as a thunderclap but as a slow dawning, the way winter gives way to spring through countless imperceptible moments, until one morning you wake to find the world transformed, and she recognized with a mixture of wonder and terror that she had fallen in love with her husband, this man who had sworn never to love her, this wounded creature of ice and shadow who had begun, without either of them intending it, to occupy every corner of her heart, until there was no room left for the careful distance she had promised herself to maintain. She had thought herself safe, had believed that her compassion was merely Christian charity, that her interest in his hidden depths was nothing more than the curiosity any woman might feel toward a mystery that shared her home. But now she understood that every time she had listened for his footsteps in the corridor, every time her pulse had quickened at the sound of his voice, every time she had found herself wondering what thoughts moved behind those storm-grey eyes, she had been falling slowly, inexorably, like a leaf drifting toward a river that would carry it away to places from which there could be no return. The danger of hope was a knife she felt pressed against her breast each morning when she woke, and each night when she lay alone in her chamber. For she had seen too clearly the walls he maintained, the way he would draw close only to retreat, the guilt that still shadowed his features whenever something like warmth flickered between them, and she knew, oh, how she knew that to love a man who believed himself incapable of love was to court a devastation from which she might never recover. She resolved, therefore, to guard her heart, to wrap it in iron and ice of her own making, to accept whatever crumbs of connection he offered, without allowing herself to hunger for the feast she increasingly craved. But the heart, that treacherous organ, refused to obey the dictates of reason, and she found herself watching for him at breakfast, lingering in rooms where she knew he might appear, treasuring each accidental touch of hands as if it were a jewel beyond price. And Sebastian, though she could not know it, was fighting his own war against the very same enemy, he who had sworn on Isabel's grave that he would never again risk the destruction that love inevitably wrought, found himself seeking his wife's presence with a desperation that frightened him, arranging his days so that their paths might cross, inventing reasons to visit the garden where she worked or the library where she read, tormented by the memory of her gentleness in the sick-room, her absolution in the rose garden, the way she looked at him as if she could see past the monster to the man he had once been. And each time he caught himself gravitating toward her light, he heard his own voice echoing through the chapel on their wedding day. "Times I will never love you, Times." And he felt the vow tightening around his throat like a noose, even as every fiber of his being strained to break free of the promise that had once seemed his only protection against a grief too terrible to survive twice. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks prior, borne by a messenger from the Lord Lieutenant's office, and though Sebastian had crumpled it in his fist with a muttered oath, there was no escaping the social obligation that had been so carefully worded as to make refusal an impossibility. The Duke of Ashworth would host the autumn ball, the first such entertainment the manor had seen in nearly 6 years, and the county would attend to witness what many whispered might be the emergence of the mysterious new Duchess from her husband's shadow. Eleonora had overseen the preparations with a calm efficiency that belied the flutter of nerves in her breast, transforming the great ballroom from a dust-sheeted mausoleum into a glittering wonderland of candlelight and hothouse flowers, and on the evening itself she stood before her mirror in a gown of midnight blue silk that Mrs. Thornton had helped her select from a London modiste's catalogue, the colour of twilight, the housekeeper had said with unusual sentimentality, the colour of hope arriving at the end of a long day. When she descended the grand staircase to greet their arriving guests, she was aware of Sebastian waiting at the bottom, his formal evening attire rendering him more impossibly handsome than she had yet seen him, and she was aware too of the way his breath seemed to catch as she came into view, his grey eyes travelling over her with an intensity that made her skin warm beneath the silk, though he said nothing beyond the formal words required, offering his arm with the stiff courtesy of a stranger. The county had come in force, drawn by curiosity as much as obligation, and Eleonora felt their eyes upon her as she moved through the glittering assembly, the whispers that followed in her wake, the careful assessments of the women, the frankly appreciative glances of the men, and she held her head high, summoning every lesson in grace her mother had ever taught her, determined to do credit to the position she had never asked for but would not disgrace. She did not see the way Sebastian watched her from across the room, his champagne untouched in his hand, tracking her movements with the fierce attention of a man witnessing something precious that he feared might at any moment be snatched away. But she did notice when Lord Harrington, a baron of neighbouring estates, golden-haired and easy in his confidence, claimed her for a dance, and held her rather closer than propriety demanded, his compliments flowing like honey, his blue eyes bright with undisguised admiration. It was during the waltz that everything changed. Sebastian appeared at her elbow, as if materialized from shadow. His voice clipped as he claimed his rights as her husband, and as his hand settled at her waist and drew her into the dance, Eleonora felt the room around them blur and fade, until there was nothing but the music and the man and the current of electricity that arced between their bodies where they touched. And when she looked up into his eyes, she saw there not ice but fire, a jealous flame that burned away all pretense of indifference, and in that moment, spinning in his arms beneath 1,000 candles, she understood that whatever he might say, whatever vows he had sworn, Sebastian Blackwood was not immune to her after all. The guests had departed in a flurry of carriages and farewells, the great ballroom standing empty now, save for the guttering candles and the scattered remnants of an evening that had promised elegance, but delivered instead a catastrophe that would fuel the county's gossip for months to come. For they had all witnessed Lord Harrington corner the Duchess in the garden alcove, had seen the Duke emerge from the shadows like an avenging spectre, had heard the sharp crack of his words cutting through the night air as he dismissed the Baron with a cold fury that brooked no argument, and left Harrington pale and stammering his apologies before fleeing to his carriage. And now Eleonora stood in the center of her chamber, still wearing the midnight blue gown that had made her feel beautiful mere hours ago, but which now felt like a costume from a play she no longer wished to perform, facing a husband whose jaw was set like granite, and whose eyes blazed with an emotion she could not reconcile with his endless proclamations of indifference. "You had no right," she heard herself say, her voice trembling not with fear but with a fury that matched his own, born of months of uncertainty, of hope extended and withdrawn, of loving a man who refused to admit he was capable of the same. "You claim no attachment to me. You swore on our wedding day that I should expect nothing but duty, and yet you rage like a jealous husband when another man pays me the smallest attention. What am I to make of such contradiction? Sebastian, what am I to believe when your words say one thing and your actions scream another?" He stood rigid by the fireplace, his hands clenched at his sides, and she watched the battle play across his features, the way he seemed to reach for words and then discard them, the way his eyes burned into hers with something that looked agonizingly like longing before the ice descended once more, sealing away whatever truth had threatened to escape. "Harrington is a libertine and a scoundrel," he said finally, his voice flat and controlled. "I was protecting my household's reputation, nothing more. Do not flatter yourself that my intervention signified anything beyond practical concern for the Ashworth name." The cruelty of it struck her like a physical blow, and she felt something crack within her chest, some last barrier she had maintained against the full weight of her despair, and before she could stop them, the tears were streaming down her cheeks, all her careful composure dissolving in the face of this final, deliberate wound. "Then I am nothing to you," she whispered. "Nothing but a name, a duty, a transaction to settle your ledgers and preserve your precious reputation. I thought perhaps, I foolishly believed that beneath the ice there might be—" But she could not finish, could not give voice to the hopes she had harbored, and she turned away from him, her shoulders shaking with sobs she could no longer contain. And she did not see the way his hand reached toward her and then fell back, did not see the anguish that twisted his features before he mastered himself and retreated from the room without another word, leaving her alone with her grief and the dying embers of a fire that could not warm the chill spreading through her heart. And she wept until dawn, lightened the windows, understanding at last that she was breaking herself against the stone of his silence, and that if she stayed, there would soon be nothing left of her to save. 3 days passed in silence, 3 days during which Eleonora moved through the manor like a ghost, taking her meals in her chamber, avoiding the rooms where she might encounter him, feeling the last reserves of her strength draining away with each hour that brought no word, no apology, no acknowledgement that anything had passed between them at all. And on the morning of the 4th day, she woke with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins, a terrible calm settling over her heart as she understood at last what she must do to survive, for she could not continue this half-existence. Loving a man who would not love her, hoping for warmth from a heart that had chosen to remain frozen, breaking herself against walls that would never fall, and so she rose from her bed and summoned the maid to help her pack her trunks, methodically folding the gowns she had worn during her months as Duchess, leaving behind the jewels that had been presented to her as tokens of her position. She would take nothing that was not truly hers, nothing that might bind her to this house of shadows for a moment longer than necessary. The letter was the hardest part. She sat at her writing desk for nearly an hour, the quill trembling in her fingers, trying to find words that would explain without accusing, that would release him from any obligation while preserving what remained of her dignity. And in the end, she wrote simply that she thanked him for his protection of her family, that she understood he had never promised more than duty, that she released him from even that burden now, and would live quietly with her father and trouble him no more. She did not write that she loved him. For what purpose would such a confession serve except to humiliate her further? And she sealed the letter with steady hands, though her heart was shattering within her chest. She was closing the last trunk when the door burst open without warning, and Sebastian stood on the threshold, his face pale as death, his dark hair disheveled as if he had run his hands through it 1,000 times, and in his shaking grip she saw the letter somehow intercepted, somehow discovered, before she could place it on his desk and slip away. And his eyes as they met hers held something she had never seen there before, something raw and desperate and terrified, stripped of all the ice and iron that had armored him for so long. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice hoarse, the words torn from him as if they caused physical pain. "What madness is this? Eleonora, you cannot mean to leave. You cannot." And he seemed to struggle for breath, his hand crushing the letter as he stepped into the room, his gaze falling upon the packed trunks with an expression of such anguish that she felt her own resolve waver despite everything, despite the cruelty of the ballroom night, despite all his denials. "I can," she whispered. "I must. I cannot survive loving you, Sebastian, not when you will not." But he crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, and his hands caught her shoulders, and his eyes burned into hers with a fire that consumed every wall, every defense, every carefully constructed lie he had told himself and told her. And when he spoke, his voice broke on the words like a ship breaking on rocks. "You cannot leave, do you not understand, Eleonora? You are the only light in this house of shadows, the only warmth I have known in 5 years of winter, and if you go, you will take with you every reason I have found to draw breath in the morning. Please, please do not go." The silence that followed his words stretched between them like a held breath, and Eleonora stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs, scarcely daring to believe what she had heard. The only light in this house of shadows. He had called her, and yet, how could she trust such words when he had spent months building walls between them, when he had sworn on their wedding day that she should expect nothing but cold duty, when only 3 nights ago he had dismissed her tears as flattery and left her weeping alone until dawn? But his hands still gripped her shoulders, trembling now, and his eyes held none of the ice she had grown accustomed to, only a raw and terrible vulnerability that stripped away the fearsome duke and revealed beneath him a man who was simply, desperately afraid. "You speak of light," she whispered, her voice breaking, "but you have done everything in your power to extinguish hope. Why should I believe you now, Sebastian, when you have spent our entire marriage convincing me that your heart is beyond my reach?" And something seemed to collapse within him at her words, some final fortress crumbling to dust, and he released her shoulders only to take her hands in his, pressing them against his chest where she could feel the wild, unsteady rhythm of his heart, and when he spoke his voice was ragged with a pain that had been buried for 5 long years. "Because I am a coward," he said, the confession torn from somewhere deep within him. "Because I have been terrified, every moment. Since you arrived at this house I watched Isabel fade away, watched her slip into a darkness I could not reach, and I blamed myself. I believed that my love was poison, that everything I touched withered and died. And when you came here with your quiet courage and your gentle heart, I knew from the first moment that you had the power to destroy me utterly, and so I built my walls and I spoke my cruelties, and I told myself that if I could make you hate me, if I could drive you away before you took root in my heart, then I would be safe. Then I would never again have to stand beside a grave and know that I had failed to save someone I loved." His grip on her hands tightened, and she saw tears gathering in his dark eyes, tears she had never imagined this proud, cold man capable of shedding, and his next words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything she had believed. "But it was already too late," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were in my heart before I knew to guard against you when I found you in the library that first night, when I watched you plant flowers in my dying garden, When you left tea at my door after my nightmares and asked for nothing in return. When you sat beside Thomas through his fever and showed more care for a servant's child than any lady of your station. Should I loved you? Eleonora, I have loved you for months, fighting it every day, telling myself that my vow still held, even as it shattered 1,000 times over. And the night of the ball, when I saw Harrington reach for you, I understood at last that I was not merely protecting the Ashworth name. I was burning with a jealousy so fierce it terrified me, because it meant my defenses had failed completely. He lifted one of her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her trembling fingers, and his eyes never left hers as he spoke the words she had despaired of ever hearing. I swore I would never love you. I have broken that oath every single day since you became my wife, and I am done pretending otherwise. I am done hiding behind my fear. I love you. Eleonora, I love you. And if you still wish to leave, I will not stop you, but I am begging you. Please, please stay. And the tears were streaming down her cheeks now, but they were no longer tears of despair, and she freed her hands from his only to lift them to his face, cradling his jaw as she had longed to do for so many silent, aching months. Aching months. I loved you, she whispered back. I loved you when I should have hated you. I loved you when you gave me nothing but ice. I loved you, and it was breaking me apart. But I am here, Sebastian. I am still here. They stood there for a long moment, her hands cradling his face, his tears wet against her palms. And then slowly, reverently, Sebastian lowered his forehead to rest against hers, their breath mingling in the space between them as the packed trunks stood forgotten and the crumpled letter lay abandoned on the floor. But the chamber felt too small, suddenly, too weighted with the ghosts of all the lonely nights she had spent within its walls, and as if reading her thoughts, Sebastian took her hand and led her wordlessly from the room, down the darkened corridors where candles flickered in their sconces, through the great doors that opened onto the garden she had labored over for so many months, and the night air rushed to meet them, cool and sweet with the scent of roses that bloomed, white and red and pink in the moonlight, the garden that had been dying when she arrived, now alive and flourishing as if it had been waiting, as they all had been waiting, for this moment of surrender. The clouds that had gathered at sunset were drifting apart as they walked among the flowers, and Eleonora looked up to see stars emerging one by one, scattered across the velvet darkness like diamonds cast by a careless hand, and Sebastian stopped beside the rose arbor where she had spent so many solitary hours, where she had whispered her secrets to the thorns and prayed for strength to endure another day without hope. But there was hope now, hope blazing through her like fire, and when she turned to face him, she found him watching her with an expression of such naked adoration that fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I have dreamed of this, he whispered, reaching up to brush the tears from her face with trembling fingers. I have stood at my window and watched you in this garden and dreamed of coming to you, of taking you in my arms, of telling you everything. I was too cowardly to speak, but I convinced myself I had no right, that I would only bring you sorrow, that you deserved better than a man as broken as I am. And she shook her head, pressing her hand over his heart again where it beat strong and steady beneath her palm. I never wanted better, she answered. I only ever wanted you the man who leaves food for stray dogs, who buys shoes for servants' children, who rides through storms to save a gardener's boy, who reads poetry alone at midnight because he feels too deeply and fears to show it. That man, Sebastian, the one you tried so hard to hide from me, he is the one I love. And at her words, something seemed to release within him, some final chain falling away, and he cupped her face in his hands and lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that was tender and desperate and healing all at once. A kiss that tasted of tears and starlight and the sweetness of roses, and Eleonora felt the world fall away until nothing existed but his lips against hers, his arms gathering her close, his heart beating in time with her own. And when at last they drew apart, he whispered her name against her hair like a prayer, like a promise, like a vow that would never again be broken. And above them the last clouds parted to reveal a sky brilliant with stars, and the old house seemed to sigh with relief, as if it too had been holding its breath for 5 long years, waiting for the shadow of grief to lift, waiting for love to return to its halls at last. The transformation of Ashworth Manor began the very next morning, when Sebastian took Eleonora's hand and led her to the east wing, that haunted corridor she had entered only once, in secret, with guilt heavy in her chest, and together they opened every door, drew back every curtain, let the pale autumn sunlight flood into rooms that had been shrouded in darkness for 5 long years, and as they stood in Isabel's preserved chamber, Sebastian spoke of her at last, without the crushing weight of guilt, spoke of her illness and her suffering and his helplessness, and Eleonora listened and held his hand, and helped him finally, gently, say goodbye. They packed away Isabel's belongings with reverence and care, keeping a few precious mementos but releasing the rest, and when the room stood empty, Sebastian pressed his forehead to Eleonora's and whispered, "Thank you," with such raw gratitude that she understood this was the true beginning of his healing. The moment he allowed himself to stop living as a memorial to his failures and start building something new. In the weeks that followed, the manor seemed to awaken from a long and troubled sleep. Painters arrived to brighten the faded walls. Craftsmen repaired the crumbling stonework, and the servants moved through the halls with lighter steps and easier smiles, no longer treading carefully around a master whose grief had made him sharp and cold, but instead serving a duke who knew their names, who inquired after their families, who laughed, actually laughed, a sound so foreign to Ashworth that Mrs. Thornton was moved to tears the first time she heard it, echoing through the corridors. The village, too, began to notice the change. Sebastian rode through the streets without his customary scowl, stopped to speak with shopkeepers and farmers, donated generously to the church fund and the village school, and the whispers that had once painted him as ruthless and cold now spoke in wondering tones of transformation, of the new duchess who had somehow thawed the ice around his heart, and the old woman who had told Eleonora of the young duke before his first marriage smiled knowingly whenever she saw them pass, as if she had always believed this day would come. But it was the small, private moments that Eleonora treasured most, the way Sebastian would seek her out in the library just to sit beside her while she read, the walks they took together across the windswept moors, with their hands entwined and their shoulders touching, the dinners that stretched long into the evening because neither could bear to end their conversations, the way he looked at her across every room as if she were the most wondrous thing he had ever beheld, and the nights, oh, the nights, when he came to her chamber, not out of duty, but out of desperate, consuming love, when he whispered her name against her skin and held her as if she were precious beyond measure. And Eleonora, who had arrived at Ashworth expecting nothing but cold survival, found herself glowing with a happiness so profound it sometimes frightened her, as if surely such joy could not last, could not be real. But Sebastian seemed to sense these moments of doubt, and he would take her face in his hands and look into her eyes and say, "I love you, I will always love you, you have saved me," until she believed him, until the fear faded and only the warmth remained, spreading through the old house like sunlight through opened curtains, bringing life back to every shadowed corner, every forgotten room, every heart that had grown cold in the long winter of the Duke's grief. 5 autumns had painted the moors in gold and copper since the night Eleonora had unpacked her trunks and chosen to stay, and on this particular October morning she stood on the terrace of Ashworth Manor, watching rain fall softly over the gardens. But this rain was nothing like the merciless storms that had greeted her arrival all those years ago, nothing like the grey deluge that had seemed to weep for the sorrow contained within these walls. This rain was gentle, nourishing, the kind that coaxed the last roses of the season into bloom and filled the air with the rich scent of wet earth and growing things, and as Eleonora pulled her shawl closer against the pleasant chill, she marveled at how completely the world had transformed, how the manor that had once felt like a prison now felt like the only home she had ever truly known. The sound of children's laughter rang out from somewhere in the garden below, bright and clear as silver bells, and Eleonora's heart swelled as she watched her daughters emerge from behind the hedgerows. Charlotte, who was 4 and had inherited her father's dark hair and serious brow, but laughed more easily than Sebastian had ever learned to do at that age, and little Rose, just 2 years old, toddling determinedly after her sister, with her mother's honey-coloured eyes shining with mischief, and behind them came Sebastian himself, the once feared Duke of Ashworth, his coat abandoned somewhere on the lawn, his white shirt dampening in the rain as he chased the girls with exaggerated growls and outstretched arms, pretending to be the monster in whatever game they had invented. And when Charlotte shrieked with delighted terror and Rose collapsed into giggles on the wet grass, Eleonora pressed her hand to her heart and felt tears prick her eyes at the sheer impossible wonder of it all. This man, this laughing, rain-soaked, joy-filled man who scooped his youngest daughter into his arms and pressed kisses to her round cheeks, while Charlotte clung to his leg, begging for her turn. This could not be the same man who had stood in the entrance hall 6 years ago and declared with such cold certainty that he would never love her, and yet it was, transformed so completely that sometimes even Mrs. Thornton, who had known him since boyhood, would stop in doorways simply to stare at him in wondering disbelief. Sebastian looked up then, as if sensing her gaze, and even across the distance of the garden, Eleonora could see the smile that spread across his face when his eyes found hers, not the polite mask he had once worn, not the sardonic twist of his earlier days, but a smile of such pure, uncomplicated happiness that it stole her breath even now, even after 5 years of marriage that had exceeded every secret hope she had barely dared to harbor during those first difficult months. He set Rose down gently, whispered something to Charlotte that made her nod importantly and take her sister's hand. And then he was striding across the garden toward the terrace, heedless of the rain that darkened his hair and ran in rivulets down his face, and when he reached her he pulled her into his arms without hesitation, without the restraint that had once governed his every interaction, and Eleonora laughed as the rain soaked through her shawl, and his wet embrace dampened her dress. But she did not pull away, could not pull away, because even after all this time his arms remained her favorite place in all the world. "You will catch your death," she murmured against his chest, but there was no real reproach in her voice, only tenderness. And Sebastian pressed his lips to her hair, that familiar gesture, that beloved habit, and when he spoke his voice was rough with an emotion that had never dimmed, never faded, only deepened with each passing season. "I will love you," he whispered, the words a deliberate echo of the vow he had so foolishly made and so thoroughly broken, transformed now into a promise he renewed each day in 1,000 small ways. Always, Eleonora, always. Dear listener, as the rain continues to fall softly over Ashworth Manor and the Duke holds his Duchess close upon the terrace, while their daughters play among the roses that once grew wild and neglected in a garden no one tended, perhaps you find yourself wondering what truth lies at the heart of this tale. What wisdom can be drawn from the story of a man who swore he would never love, and a woman who asked for nothing, yet gave everything? And so, let me speak to you now, not of Sebastian and Eleonora, but of the quiet miracles that unfold in spaces between despair and hope, in the patient accumulation of small kindnesses that can, over time, wear down even the highest walls built by grief and fear and the terrible conviction that one is unworthy of love. We live in a world that celebrates grand gestures and instant transformations, that tells us hearts can be won in a single glance and souls can be healed with a single kiss, but the truth is far more humble and far more beautiful. The truth is that love most often arrives not as a thunderbolt, but as a gentle rain, soaking slowly into soil that has grown hard and cracked from too many seasons of drought. And the truth is that the people who seem most beyond saving are often those who need saving most desperately, who have built their fortresses of ice and stone, not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much and cannot bear the weight of it. If you have ever loved someone who seemed incapable of loving you back, if you have ever stood at a window watching storms rage across a desolate landscape and wondered if warmth would ever return to the cold chambers of your life, if you have ever been tempted to abandon hope because hope itself had become too painful to carry, then perhaps this story has whispered something to your heart that you needed to hear. Perhaps it has reminded you that beneath the cruelest exterior, there may beat a heart that is simply terrified of its own capacity for feeling, and that your patience, your kindness, your quiet and steadfast presence may be the very thing that finally gives that heart permission to emerge from its long and lonely winter. But let me also say this: you cannot save someone who does not wish to be saved, and you must never lose yourself entirely in the project of another's redemption. Eleonora survived because she maintained her dignity, because she continued to cultivate her own garden even when the master of the house would not look upon it, because she understood that her worth did not depend upon Sebastian's recognition of it, and it was precisely this wholeness, this gentle strength, that finally drew him out of his darkness and into her light. So go forward, dear listener, with hope but also with wisdom, with patience but also with self-preservation, knowing that love is not a battle to be won, but a garden to be tended, and that the most beautiful roses often bloom in soil that was once considered barren and beyond repair. May your own heart find its springtime. May the walls around you crumble at exactly the right moment. May someone leave a cup of warm tea at your door when the storms rage within. And when at last you find yourself standing in the rain with arms wrapped around you and words of love whispered against your hair, may you know in the deepest chambers of your being that you were always worthy of this tenderness, always deserving of this joy, always capable of the transformation that seemed so impossible on all those grey and desperate mornings when you wondered if the sun would ever shine again. Rest now, dream softly, and believe, always believe, in the redemption of those who have forgotten how to believe in themselves.